She had pulled into the small county library's lot for less than 10 minutes. The air that evening tasted of heat and wood smoke. Cicadas rasped in the maples. A handful of fluorescent lights hummed under the building's eaves. Passers-by were scrolling through phones. No one expected the sheriff of the county to step out of his squad car and holler across the asphalt. What followed was quick enough to be captured on a dozen devices and small enough to leave a bruise that would not fade. Sheriff Wayne Hollister walked up to the passenger side of the car, leaned down, and spoke to the woman behind the wheel in a tone that left no room for doubt. Within minutes, she was in handcuffs. A book bag lay open on the passenger seat. Onlookers filmed with their phones. The sheriff delivered a handful of lines, taunts and commands caught mid-sentence, and then, after the booking photos and fingerprints, a visible shift. He leaned forward, took a small business card from her wallet, read it, and for 15 seconds his face went still. The freeze lasted long enough to feel like a lifetime. People around the booking area stared. For those with cameras, the second-hand tapes captured the glint of the metal badge, the sheriff's eyes scanning neat type on a card. A dozen phones recorded the same silent moment. Then he said two things that would later matter in the ledger of evidence. He ordered her release, and he told someone in his office to delete the record. If the camera angles are the story's spine, that tiny rectangle of cardstock became the heart. What it said would make one man hesitate and set in motion a cascade that would test the county's institutions, a professor's career, and a family's endurance. Before the images circulated, before the county press conference and the early denials, before complaints were written and lawyers consulted, the woman handcuffed in the library parking lot had been Dr. Pamela Crawford, 52 years old, a criminal justice professor with a reputation for measured argument and an academic career built on critiques of the very systems that were now bearing down on her. She was in town to check on her mother. 2 hours earlier, Pamela had driven the 3 miles from her childhood home, Dorothy Crawford's small bungalow on a shaded block, to the library to pick up a book. It was a quick stop, she told herself. 5 minutes, maybe 10. She left her mother's medicine list on the kitchen table and tucked her keys into a tote bag beside the doorway. She had worked for decades studying policing and policy. She had written about institutional bias and testified to reform commissions. She had colleagues, graduate students, and a tenure file stamped with arguments about accountability. She had also carried a history that nobody in the sheriff's office seemed to forget. A brother named Curtis who walked out of a detention episode with a jaw wired, and a story that had never reached a legal conclusion.
The family's grief was private, but it had shaped Pamela's work and her caution. The library lot that afternoon was near empty. She parked close to a yellow curb that locals used for quick errands. She had no reason to believe the parking job would attract attention. The county was small, and the sheriff had been in office a dozen years. His face was a commonplace in street photographs, his name on bumper stickers and t-shirts at charity runs. People in towns like this tend to put names to faces quickly. Sheriff, banker, pastor. Those names mean power in ways that textbooks don't always teach. Walking across the lot with a paper bag in one hand and a book under her arm, Pamela noticed a squad car idling near the library entrance. Sheriff Wayne Hollister stepped out with other deputies a moment later. The exchange that followed, startling in its speed, was later played back frame by frame on local channels. The sheriff told her the car had been parked too close to a sign, then that it looked suspicious, then, more pointedly, that she didn't belong. The words that made their way into reports carried a particular sting. Either you stole this vehicle, either way you don't belong here. Those phrases became part of a montage of clips shown in later hearings, overlaid with timestamps and camera angles, each one at once documentary and indictment. Pamela protested. She said she was visiting her mother. She showed a photo of Dorothy on her phone. She reached for her wallet to produce identification, thinking it would wrap up the moment. The sheriff's posture hardened. He asked questions. He asked for identification. He put a hand on the doorframe and told her to step out. Phones rose. A man standing under the library awning started recording like everyone else, an automatic civic response in a county where people had long learned that a camera sometimes keeps a hand honest. She was led to the back of the squad car while a deputy read a citation for a minor parking violation. The cameras filmed the handcuffs closing around her wrists. Someone on the sidewalk said, "She's a professor, look at her card." That line would later appear in witness statements and interviews. In the booking room, under fluorescent lights that flattened faces, a clerk took her prints and posed her for the standardized frontal photograph that would become, for a time, a public record that could be circulated without context. It was during those procedural minutes, when the machine of arrest seemed to hum with its own inevitability, that Pamela slid the small business card into the sheriff's hand. It was unadorned. Her name, her title, the university's logo. Her voice, calm but steady, said something like, "I'm Dr. Pamela Crawford. I teach criminal justice." That card did what the cameras captured best. It short-circuited an imagined script the sheriff had been acting out. He read it. He paused. The audio picked up the rustle of paper.
For 15 seconds, citizens would later time it by watching the footage. His face registered something that arrested not only his movement, but the rhythm of the room. Then he instructed the release of the booking. Not only that, he told an officer to remove the entry from the records. "Release her. Delete the booking record," a voice said, plain and recorded. Those words, repeated in witness statements, became evidence in themselves, a command to erase a formal act of the state. The clerk later testified that she was ordered to log the arrest as an incident, not an arrest, and to keep no photograph beyond internal use. The camera's angle didn't change. The same lenses that had fixed Pamela's cuffs now captured the attempt to make the arrest disappear. The footage would travel. Neighbors uploaded clips. A patron's phone caught the exchange between Pamela and the sheriff. Someone else sent a cloud link to a local reporter. Within hours, the county's public timeline altered. A small local Facebook group shared the footage with outraged comments. The sheriff's office released a terse statement by daybreak, language shaped to minimize public anger, stressing that no formal charges would be pursued for what it called a parking enforcement matter, and emphasizing the sheriff's long service to the community. The press release read like a patch of calm on an otherwise spinning wheel, no hint of the 15-second freeze. No mention was made of the deletion order, but the recordings existed. They were out of the sheriff's hands. Pamela's first response was to file an internal complaint. She called the university. She wanted records preserved. She wanted witnesses interviewed. She wanted a public accounting. The university's response, formal and swift, was at first support couched in institutional caution. Her department had called and said the university would stand by faculty rights. Within 48 hours, the dean, concerned about optics, put her on administrative leave pending an inquiry into the incident and any potential impact on the institution's relationships with local officials. The letter was clinical, aimed more at schools of thought than at shared histories. "We have placed you on leave to ensure a full and impartial review." Pamela felt the measure as a professional blow. She had expected a university to be a place that protected voices who challenged power. She also knew how brittle reputations can be when they collide with proximity to politics. At the same time, the sheriff held a press conference. He stood at the podium beneath an emblematic county seal, flanked by deputies. His statement emphasized a misunderstanding, a routine enforcement action, and the sheriff's commitment to due process. Journalists in the room asked about the footage. His answers were succinct and framed to steer the story away from procedural questions and toward personal prudence.
The sheriff's language was measured, and in the days that followed, his office released personnel records showing the sheriff's long tenure and awards for public safety. Those materials were part of a curated narrative, a man of the county, a protector, a local figure who had shepherded his community through storms. But in the early hours after the arrest became public, something else began to surface in the feeds and the inboxes. People who had once filed complaints about other incidents posted records, a list of arrests in which the sheriff had personally been involved. An analysis of public personnel records compiled by a local watchdog group listed 89 arrests directly linked to the sheriff's custody actions between 2019 and 2024. An overlay of county demographic data in a graphic, shown on screen in later meetings, read 68% of those arrested in the sheriff's personally administered arrests were black, while the county itself was 31% black by population figures in the same time frame. The numbers did not prove motivation, but they formed a context. When statistics line up with lived accounts of humiliation, the two coalitions press on each other like tectonic plates. Pamela watched the stream of commentary with a growing sense of exposure. Her professional life was now a headline, and the thumbnail was the booking photo, one of the items the sheriff had told his clerks to purge. She had long argued in op-eds and testimony that mugshots are not neutral artifacts. They are the handed-down currency of suspicion. On the morning after the arrest, she found her own photographs circulating with snide captions that stripped context from the scene. Sympathy showed up too. Students and colleagues sent messages of support, but the currents were destabilizing. A local television reporter arrived at her mother's porch. Diane Foster, who covered county politics and had a reputation for dogged reporting, asked Pamela a set of careful questions and recorded the conversation. Diane had a demeanor that suggested she believed in the public's right to know. She asked about the county's record, the sheriff's past, and the personal toll of police encounters. In Diane's piece that evening, Pamela's voice was framed as a scholar who had become a subject of the systems she studied, an inversion that made the story both human and politically combustible. The sheriff's office dialed up damage control. A press release emphasized that the arrest had been for a parking violation and that the decision to release was made after confirmation that no criminal action was warranted.
The omission of the deletion command in the release did not stop residents from re-watching the video and MPs from asking about record preservation. The public attention fell unevenly between two narratives: the sheriff's insistence on the normalcy of enforcement and a growing chorus that saw the arrest as evidence of personal humiliation and possible overreach.
Within days, the shifting tides reached Pamela's home. Her mother, Dorothy, a woman of 78 who had lived in the same modest house for decades, began to receive messages on social media, some curt and cruel, others urging her to stand by the sheriff. Dorothy had once been a Sunday school teacher who liked cracked biscuits and could recite community histories by heart. She had no taste for conflict. But when an anonymous post appeared near midnight on a neighborhood page accusing Pamela of grandstanding and making trouble for good men who keep the peace, Dorothy felt her world tilt. Pamela started to log everything. She wrote down names of witnesses, she saved screenshots, she printed the sheriff's press release and stapled it to her notebook next to the criminal complaint she had filed. She forwarded links to administrators. She called the local ACLU affiliate and asked about preservation requests. These were small acts of procedure, but in a county where relationships mattered as much as records, paper trails were the only defense she had. The immediate public reaction divided along familiar lines. Some residents praised the sheriff for taking action that kept the town safe. Others saw the spectacle of a handcuffed woman in a public lot as emblematic of a bigger problem: the ease with which authority can make someone feel not just accused, but erased. On talk radio that week, callers argued over the footage. A few framed the incident as a momentary lapse, others framed it as part of a wider pattern. In those first 10 days, Pamela's professional network tried to anchor her. Students wrote notes about the way she had challenged them to think critically about arrest practices. A colleague offered to testify to her character. A civil rights attorney whom Pamela contacted advised her on the mechanics of a civil claim and on the necessity of preserving all digital evidence. The attorney's office sent a short email with a checklist: preserve dashcam footage, preserve booking photos, secure any deletion logs and system access records from the sheriff's office. Pamela's hands shook as she copied the list into her own file. But beyond the checklist came a quieter erosion. Invitations dwindled, panels and speaking engagements were postponed, and the university's leave signaled a kind of professional limbo. The administrative letter that explained the reason for the leave also noted the university's need to protect institutional relationships while the matter was examined. The phrase read like a closed door. The sheriff's office insisted there was nothing to hide. A deputy spokesman insisted that any suggestion of an intentional eraser of records was unfounded, and that all relevant documentation had been preserved according to policy. County officials released a one-paragraph statement noting that an internal review would take place. Yet the very existence of a video in which an official appeared to order deletion complicated any notion of policy preserved. Record retention is technical. The act of instructing a subordinate to delete is simple language, but simple language can create outsized consequences. Meanwhile, Pamela's neighbor, a retired nurse who had watched the arrest video and met Pamela on her porch, offered a small gesture of practical support. "If it helps, I'll watch your mother if you need to be at meetings," she said. Those walls of odd human kindness became vital. Pamela found herself accepting the neighbor's offer and arranging the first of many small logistical shifts: grocery runs, medication checks, missed class preparations. She realized the assault on a person's public identity leaks inward, into the household where evening routines once felt like ordinary life. As social media intensified, a loose coalition of community advocates began to gather evidence. They scraped the public feed for mentions of other arrests where the sheriff had been present, collected witness statements, and began to catalog anomalies. One volunteer uploaded a spreadsheet that would later be shown in council chambers: counts of arrests attributed to the sheriff, demographic breakdowns, and date ranges. The numbers charted against county population data made a pattern easier to visualize than a single arrest could ever do. In the middle of the turbulence, a small private pressure began to build on Pamela. College administrators called to ask about conflicts of interest and about what paperwork she had filed. The dean's voice was steady. The questions were procedural. The dean did not name the pressures, but they were implied: donors, community relationships, partnerships that required a more tempered public face. The university was a creature of interlocking dependencies. Pamela recognized that her case, public, messy, and politically flavored, had become one more variable in an ecosystem that prized stability. Diane Foster continued to report. Her first pieces focused on the footage, the recorded orders, and the community reaction. She interviewed witnesses and included their names and short statements. Her tone was investigative. She was precise about the facts: who was present, what documents had been requested, and what the sheriff's office had said. For a time, Diane was the public conduit for Pamela's version.
The journalist's coverage amplified the footage and the documentation into a wider conversation. People began to ask difficult questions. Why had an arrest been made for a minor violation in a library parking lot? Why had the booking record been ordered deleted? Who gave that order? That same week, a local pastor organized a small vigil outside the library, candles flaring on the pavement. It was not a large demonstration, just a scattering of neighbors, students, and family friends who held signs calling for fairness and transparency.
Gloria Atkins, the mother of Jerome Atkins, came and stood near the periphery. She would later become a central witness in the unfolding events. Already she carried her own grief and suspicion, shaped by her son's arrest and subsequent death. At the vigil, she hugged Pamela and said, softly, "They do this to people like us." The comment landed like a small stone in a pond. The ripples would widen. Pamela's complaint moved slowly through internal channels. The sheriff's office logged a minimal immediate corrective action, an internal protocol review, a promise to preserve footage, and an insistence that the matter would be resolved according to policy. But policy and practice are not always the same. An instruction to erase a record leaves a trace only if someone preserves it. In Pamela's case, the presence of multiple eyewitness recordings was the reason the deletion could not simply erase what had happened. The existence of cameras and community recording devices complicated the sheriff's attempt to make the moment vanish. As the town turned the incident over in public and private conversations, a subtler force took hold, the price exacted for speaking up. Pamela's inbox filled with messages. Some were supportive, some menacing. Her mother, who had always brushed off county politics as the province of other people, began to worry. She asked Pamela, over tea, whether there was anything she should do. Dorothy's hands shook once when she mentioned the sheriff, an involuntary reaction to public controversy she had not asked for. Dorothy asked, in the hush of the kitchen, if Pamela was safe. Pamela filed additional records. She requested copies of the booking log and preservation of dashcam footage. She photocopied the business card and taped it into her folder next to a timeline of the day's events. She was methodical because she had to be. Measuring what had been done to her required the same precision she had used in decades of academic work. Even as she gathered documents, something more personal crept into the moment, a recognition of what it meant to be arrested in public not merely as a legal fact but as a social punishment. The photograph of her in handcuffs would sit on screens and in conversations long after the legal question was settled. Mugshots carry a gravity that a written citation does not. They harden into a visual claim. They are a kind of record that, once out in the world, follows a person in intangible but traceable ways. Background checks, social media tags, a casual remark from someone at the grocery store. Pamela, who had spent her career talking about these exact mechanics, found herself inhabiting the role she had once only taught. By the end of the first week, the county's soundscape had changed. The sheriff's office continued to hold its line on public statements, but behind the scenes, the currents were shifting. A small group of advocates requested that the county council call a public hearing. A few council members responded cautiously. They did not want to be seen as taking sides, but they recognized that the controversy could not simply evaporate. Community organizers with long memories began to collect testimonies from residents who described a pattern of humiliations, traffic stops that escalated, arrests that seemed to land disproportionately on certain neighborhoods. Their stories were anecdotal at first, but when matched with public records that volunteers had compiled, a clearer outline of concern emerged. In the midst of this, Pamela had to decide how much to fight in public and how much to preserve for possible legal action. Her attorney asked for patience and for preservation orders, but patience felt like a luxury she could not afford when her mother was at home and frightened. The university's leave had taken away her daily anchors, the classroom, the students who expected her to hold court on institutional reform. She spent hours on the porch with Dorothy, talking about the small things that held them together. Favorite recipes, Sunday songs, stories about Curtis when he was a boy. Pamela found that these personal acts of life were a bulwark in a time of public unraveling. Between the community reactions, the press, and the county statements, one constant thread remained: the image of the card. That small rectangle had not only interrupted an abusive sequence, it had also recorded, with its very existence, the fact that one person's identity could reorder an entire encounter. The sheriff's pause, the 15 seconds caught in 3 different camera angles, was a hinge from which 2 versions of the county's story would swing. One of a man following routine enforcement, the other of a public official whose exercise of discretionary power extended into private humiliation and the attempted covering up of that exercise. When Pamela left her mother's porch late that week, she carried a folder of papers and a sense of responsibility that felt heavier than it had any right to. She had become, reluctantly, both the subject of study and the steward of record, a keeper of evidence. She told herself she would be careful with her words and meticulous with her files. She agreed to every phone interview that felt responsible and declined those that did not. She kept returning to one thought in the quiet moments between counsel calls and emails: that identity, what someone is on the business card or in a research file, can make a difference in the most intimate encounters with power. And yet, even with a growing pile of documentary evidence and public accounts, there was an awareness that paperwork alone cannot undo the damage of public shaming. The attempt to delete an arrest is not only an administrative command, it is a statement about who gets to be officially seen and who can be made invisible. That kernel, visibility versus erasure, became the conceptual axis of what came next. If appearances, recordings, and documents were the language of accountability, then preserving them became a civic duty. At the end of that first week, Pamela duplicated every file she could lay hands on. She sent copies to her attorney, to a trusted colleague, and to a reporter she believed in. The footage of the arrest had been viewed thousands of times online. The business card was now a datum in a case file. People in the county spoke in quieter tones about the implications of what they had seen. The sheriff's office maintained its posture of routine enforcement. The sheriff's face remained familiar in public photographs. But inside the sheriff's office, decisions were being made that would not be visible to the public for some time. Decisions about how records were kept, about how staff were instructed to describe the event, and about the political realities of scrutiny. The story that had begun with a parking infringement had moved in the span of days towards institutional questions. Who controls records? How do small acts of authority escalate? And what happens when someone with a public identity stands up to that authority? Pamela knew the answers would not be simple. The wheels of formal investigation often turn with bureaucratic slowness, and evidence could be hidden or lost if not preserved. Her hope, such as it was, rested on an unlikely alliance of witnesses, recordings, and the indignation of a public that had seen the footage and wanted explanations. She had no illusions about the price she might pay. The leave from the university, the whispering in community meetings, the social media attacks, all of it suggested that speaking up carried costs. But she also understood, with quiet certainty, that the act of preserving records and telling the story was essential if anything meaningful were to come of it. The alternative, letting an image be scrubbed from the official ledger as though nothing had happened, felt like surrender to an architecture of power that specialized in erasing discomfort. And so Pamela prepared for a longer fight. She organized her files, she scheduled meetings with civil rights lawyers, she kept a small notebook where she wrote witness names and times. She called Diane Foster to thank her for the early reporting and to ask that the reporter keep the story alive. Diane's voice on the phone was firm and encouraging. The reporting would continue, she said, and she would ask for preservation orders. Pamela felt the relief of a human ally in the press. But alliances are fragile things. Even as reporters and advocates rallied, other forces began to press. Quiet phone calls to university administrators, thinly veiled suggestions that controversy could hurt grandchildren of donors that had nothing to do with the county, and the arrival of anonymous posts that turned the human story into a political football. Pamela found herself pausing before accepting interview requests.
She watched her own image propagate online in ways that felt beyond her control. 2 weeks after the arrest, a brick struck Dorothy's living room window in the middle of the night. The sound woke Dorothy, who called out for her daughter. Pamela drove over immediately, her mind running through people she knew in the neighborhood and the list of recent critics of the sheriff's office. The police took a report but declined to offer much assurance. Dorothy felt shaken and, days later, suffered a medical episode that doctors attributed to the stress and trauma of the incident. In the emergency room, machines hummed, and Pamela watched the life of her mother move into the hands of professionals who measured pulses and prescribed rest. Dorothy's stroke was documented in clinical records and would later be part of the narrative about the personal toll the dispute took on the Crawford family. The county's public statements would not connect the window to the arrest. The linkage was drawn by the family's attorney and by journalists who traced the sequence of online threats, the brick, and the subsequent medical emergency. When the news of Dorothy's hospitalization circulated, the tenor of public conversation shifted from curiosity to concern. People who had formerly dismissed the arrest as a misunderstanding found themselves uncomfortable in their certainty. Pamela's life narrowed to a series of urgent tasks: hospital visits, legal filings, and the careful management of media inquiries. Her stash of documents, which once had been research materials for articles and lectures, now served as evidence. She rehearsed what to say in interviews, mindful of the legal landscape and of the need to protect her mother from further exposure. Through it all, she continued to carry with her the memory of the sheriff's face as he read her card and froze. That pause, preserved on multiple devices, had become the hinge of the story. It was small and yet enormous enough to alter trajectories. By the time the county council convened thinking about what, if anything, to do, a community had begun to collect around Pamela. People who had never met her in person sent emails of support. Students forked tribute notes into the inbox of the department. The story had become not only about a parking violation, but about the larger question of who gets to decide who belongs in a town's spaces and under what terms public authority can be exercised. And in the quiet between legal briefs and hospital visits, Pamela sometimes allowed herself the thought that what had happened, what had been recorded and what had been preserved, might do more than simply expose a single bad encounter. It could, she hoped, be the beginning of a longer reckoning about how official acts of power are recorded, preserved, and accounted for. She could not predict how long that process would take, nor who would stand with her when the costs rose higher.
What she knew for certain was this: the small rectangle of her business card had changed the arc of a single exchange, and that arc, captured on camera, would not be easy to fold back into obscurity. If this story matters to you and you want to follow the complete document-backed walkthrough of what happens next, stay with this reporting and check the links to the primary documents in the description below. In the days that followed, as legal counsel prepared preservation requests and community members organized public comment, a quieter betrayal was taking shape, one that would test the fragile alliances Pamela had formed. A reporter who had once encouraged her to go public began to pull back in ways Pamela could not yet understand. Emails were exchanged, promises made and then softened, and a small private meeting in which the terms of coverage were discussed would, months later, reveal a shifting calculus about who tells the story and who keeps quiet. For the moment, however, the town kept watching. Footage circulated, papers were filed, and Dorothy recovered slowly, buoyed by blankets and low-voiced prayers from the kitchen. The arrest that began as a brief public annoyance had become an inquiry into how power is exercised in a county where many voices felt they had been kept small for too long. The business card, pamphlet-sized, laminated by meaning, remained at the center, a tiny object with outsized consequences. By the time Pamela returned home from the hospital, daylight had draped the porch in late afternoon gold. Dorothy slept in a chair, a blanket tucked under her chin. Fireflies blinked in the yard. The ordinary small miracles of family life, sipping tea, reading a familiar passage from a dog-eared book, reconstituted a fragile peace. Yet that evening was also threaded with the knowledge that what had happened in a library parking lot would not stay there. The sheriff had known her name. He had paused. He ordered a deletion. The videotapes existed. Evidence had been gathered. And not everyone who had been helpful in public would necessarily remain helpful in private. Those tensions would shape the next act of this story, the part where documents must be authenticated, witnesses must decide whether to testify, and a county council would be forced into a difficult vote. For now, the public record was a patchwork: recordings, witness statements, a terse press release, and the growing hum of a community taking notice. Pamela sat on the porch with her mother and considered how fragile dignity could be when placed in front of a camera and a badge. She had expected to study power from a distance. Instead, she now lived inside of it. The sheriff's 15-second pause had created a hinge. The remainder of the story would swing on whether those who had seen it were willing to do the hard work of holding institutions to account.
In the meantime, evidence would continue to be gathered, and the small acts of civic stewardship, the saving of a video, the printing of a log, the notarizing of a statement, would quietly accumulate like sediment, ready to be analyzed by those who care about truth and procedure. And somewhere, in an office that had access to the sheriff's personnel systems, a log entry might be missing, or might be found. The difference would become part of the record. When Pamela finally slept that night, her dreams returned to the library lot, the hum of fluorescent lights, the click of handcuffs, and the flat white of a business card against the sheriff's palm. She woke before dawn with the same image, and with the sense that the fight ahead would be as much about documents and preservation as it would be about public outrage. The town had been given a choice: to let a moment be scrubbed or to insist that the tapes and the records be preserved, so the truth, whatever its shape, could be accounted for. What she could not foresee was how far the next revelations would reach, or who would be willing to risk professional or personal cost to bring deleted footage back into the light. But she knew this: someone had recorded more than a single encounter. Someone, somewhere, had kept files that could corroborate the memory of that 15-second pause. And if those files surfaced, they would not simply be pixels on a screen. They would be the material of accountability. The next break came not from a newsroom whistle or a council summons, but from a man with a worn backpack and a steady, wary manner. Raymond Oates had been a contracted IT specialist who once worked on county systems. He had watched the footage like everyone else, and then kept watching the quiet ways the records around the arrest changed, or, in some cases, vanished. He had not set out to be a hero. He had set out, he later said, to reconcile what he knew about how municipal databases worked with what he saw on a dozen phones: a sheriff ordering a deletion. He believed the systems should tell the truth. Raymond arrived at a coffee shop on the edge of town with a flash drive taped into a small manila envelope. He carried the USB like contraband and at first asked to speak off the record. Pamela's attorney met him. ACLU lawyers listened. Over the next 48 hours, what he had brought was verified in slow, meticulous steps that would be important in every legal and political forum that followed. On the drive side, Raymond had found fragments: a recovered copy of the booking room camera that internal housekeeping files still held in a temporary cache, a system log showing an administrative user under an account registered to Under Sheriff Earl Bridgewell accessing the booking database at 8:12 the night of the arrest, and an entry that reconciled the deletion command with a change in the database flag that turned an arrest entry into an incident note.
Those pieces by themselves were technical and dry. Together they outlined a sequence: arrest entered, booking photo captured, administrative access used, record altered. What made the digital traces persuasive was their context. The timestamps on the recovered files matched the timecode on the dashcam and the phone footage. The hash values on the recovered videos matched copies Raymond supplied. Metadata in the files tied them back to county cameras with device identifiers that Raymond's records cross-referenced in county procurement logs. The ACLU's tech team did what technologists do when stakes are high. They froze the files, computed cryptographic hashes, compared headers and metadata, and cross-checked server-side logs. Document shown: recovered booking room footage, a legal placard would note later in hearing materials. The team produced a step-by-step authentication memo that explained, in language a judge could rely on, how the files were recovered and why they were genuine. The memo detailed checksum values, original file sizes, and the chain of custody Raymond had initiated the moment he handed the drive to Pamela's counsel. The ACLU certified the files as authentic in a short, court-ready letter that would be circulated to council members, reporters, and the county's legal team. The certification mattered because, in the language of institutions, metadata is credibility. In the language of people, the video was easier to grasp. It showed the sheriff in the booking room, the card exchanged, the pause, the order to release and to delete. With the ACLU's authentication behind them, the legal team served preservation orders to the sheriff's office and filed a complaint that referenced the recovered files. The public record had shifted from circulating opinions to presenting verifiable artifacts. That shift forced new motions from old defenders. Under ordinary circumstances, a technical memo would be dry and forgettable. In this county, it became the hinge of public conversation. Council members who had been coy about intervening now faced a trove of documented evidence: multiple witness videos showing the arrest, recovered booking footage that filled in the angles, and server logs that traced an administrative action. A precise record of events authenticated by a reputable civil rights group changes what is politically possible. The sheriff's office issued a terse statement calling the recovered footage unauthorized access and promising a review of internal cybersecurity protocols. That framing, casting Raymond's intervention as itself improper, was part of an initial defensive posture that tried to move the debate from discretionary abuse of power to procedural violation by an outsider. Pamela did not want a man prosecuted for giving files to the public. She wanted accountability for the order to erase a public act.
The ACLU's involvement reframed the moral question as an institutional question. If records could be altered by those with system access, how could the public trust official accounts? If an arrest could be rendered editorial by a single command, what checks existed? As the files circulated among lawyers and journalists, the human cost continued. Dorothy's recovery was slow and fragile. The stroke had left her with periods of confusion and a new frailty that made Pamela's nights longer and more tired. Friends juggled shifts to sit with Dorothy. Pamela took fewer calls and made more decisions about the next legal steps. Every procedural move was nested inside the household rhythms of pills, clinic appointments, and slow meals. The legal work felt both necessary and monstrous. Necessary because the facts needed to be fixed. Monstrous because pursuing them meant repuncturing wounds and exposing Dorothy to more public scrutiny. Then came Diane Foster's change. At first, Diane had been the reporter many in town trusted. Tough, even-handed. Someone who had made a career out of digging. Her reporting had amplified the footage and the community's concerns. But in quiet conversations later revealed, Diane had told people that she had been approached by county officials with access to documents, and later by a separate intermediary who suggested that some stories could be softened for a price. No cash exchanged on camera, no explicit bribes in a way that would show up in a ledger, but promises of favorable framing, tips about what to omit, and access to other officials who could offer background material. Pamela learned this initially as rumor, and then as message headers and redacted emails that the ACLU marked "document shown" and handed to the council. Those emails were not dramatic. They were instead the commodity of compromise. Meeting notes, marked up drafts, suggestions to omit certain phrases. They mapped out an informal negotiation over tone rather than fact. Diane's editor, who had been off the page in much of the initial coverage, found herself in the middle of those negotiations too. For reasons she would later describe in a tearful testimony, Diane said she had been exhausted by weeks of threats and by the pressure of being a single reporter in a small town where access matters. She had told herself she was protecting sources. She conceded, allowed herself to believe that a negotiated framing could spare a family greater harm. Pamela's reaction to the compromise was complex. Anger, betrayal, a practical calculation about what it meant for the story to be partially told. She also understood the pressures journalists face. Still, when documents later showed that Diane had received a message offering a USB with additional files in exchange for context, Pamela's lawyer flagged it as a problem.
It raised two questions. Why would a USB be dangled as a bargaining chip, and who was using journalistic outlets to reshape public records? That USB would later enter the public theater in the way only a physical object can, passed across a able in the county chamber, its light flashing in the testimony lights. The whistleblower chain deepened. Raymond, who had initially shared files with the ACLU and with Pamela's counsel, told his story to a reporter who would not let it be softened. He described seeing an internal culture in the sheriff's office that treated records as a matter of discretion. He described a habit of reclassifying events to make them administratively tidy. For him, it was not about one man's power, but about a system that made deletion possible without public knowledge. The system makes it easy, he told a reporter in a recorded interview. If you have access, you can hide things. When the county council announced a formal public hearing, it promised to be procedural and dignified. Town halls rarely stage full forensic exhibitions. This one did. The county chamber filled with people, neighbors, students, activists, clergy, and family members. Television lights made everyone a little more careful. Fluorescent panels hummed. The agenda item that had once been a footnote, an arrest for a parking violation, now held the room's attention like a hinge. The hearing began with procedural introductions. Legal representatives read the ACLU's authentication memo aloud. On screen, technicians cued a sequence of clips. First, the dashcam footage from the sheriff's patrol vehicle that showed the initial exchange in the parking lot. Next, a patron's phone video that caught the handcuffing and the book bag on the seat. Finally, the recovered booking room footage that filled in angles the phones had missed, the receptionist's hands accomplishing standard tasks, the sheriff taking the business card, the pause that rippled through the room. Document shown, dashcam footage, the caption read as the first clip played. People in the chamber leaned forward. The dashcam showed the sheriff's approach, an exchange of words, and a sheriff who exerted his authority in a way that left little room for dialogue. The second clip showed phones and bystanders and the quick gestures of arrest. The third clip, the recovered booking footage, was the pivot. The camera caught the sheriff reading the card and pausing. The room felt the 15 seconds as if it were an audible stoppage. The sound design of the video left a small hush that felt like the air being taken out of the moment. The video then captured the sheriff issuing the release and the administrative command. After the footage, Pamela's attorney presented the deletion log, a redacted screenshot that documented an entry altering the arrest flag and noting a change made from an administrative account. Document shown, deletion log, redacted, the placard read.
The log entry included timestamps, the user account associated with Bridwell, and a short note, converted to incident. The ACLU's tech expert explained how the entry could not be created retroactively without leaving traces in multiple places. The lack of those traces suggested an attempt to obliterate a record rather than a legitimate retroactive correction. Then Gloria Atkins spoke. She did not speak as a policy analyst. She spoke as a mother whose life had been altered by another set of encounters with the sheriff's office.
Jerome Atkins had been arrested months earlier, face down in a different part of the county, by deputies that a later review would find had used a similar display of ridiculing language and force. Jerome was later found dead. His death had been ruled suicide. The immediate legal chain on Jerome's passing did not become a matter of criminal verdict in the way courts assign criminality, but Gloria's testimony was raw and human and crucial in the chamber. She described how Jerome returned from confinement fragile, how he had told her he felt humiliated by the public treatment, how in the months that followed he had become more withdrawn. She did not claim a direct legal causality between the arrest and his death. She spoke instead of the way humiliation lodges itself in a person's daily life, and how the wheel of public power grinds on private dignity. Her words were short, precise, and devastating. "You put this on him," she told the room, directing her voice not only at the sheriff, but at the idea that public officers could treat people like data points. She described sitting in a kitchen with Jerome and watching him shrink beneath the weight of official exposure. The council could not adjudicate the tragic arc of a life based on testimony alone. What it could do was weigh that testimony against a pattern of discretionary arrests faced disproportionately by black residents in the county's records. Gloria's presence made a larger point visceral. Data maps to trauma. Then Diane Foster rose. The reporter's confession did not come as spectacle. It came as something closer to contrition. Diane read a statement in which she admitted to softening certain pieces of coverage and to allowing lines of negotiation with county officials to inform drafts that she later published. "I thought I was protecting people," she said, her voice cracking. "I see now that protecting access is not the same as protecting truth." In a pocket of her coat she had the physical USB that had been part of the earlier negotiations. She extended it to the clerk of the council with a small shaking hand. The USB contained two things: a copy of emails and notes documenting the informal meetings with county officials, and an original copy of the booking room footage Diane had been offered, the one Raymond had later recovered from a different cache. Diane's admission was important for reasons beyond personal drama.
It closed a loop. What had been an informal, private bargaining of coverage was placed in public and cataloged. Between the ACLU certified files and Diane's handover of material, the evidentiary chain now had redundancy. There were multiple sources, multiple matches, and multiple confirmations. The narrative had become less disputable. Witness testimony followed. Martha Shelton, who had been under the library awning that day, described the moment she had pointed out a business card in Pamela's hand. A county clerk detailed the internal direction she had received, logged this as incident, not arrest, and then, with legal counsel present, described her discomfort at being asked to alter administrative records. Her voice trembled sometimes. It did not need to. The documentary said, dashcam, phone video, booking footage, deletion log, Diane's emails, formed a mosaic. Council members asked questions. Some focused on procedural fixes, how to harden retention policies, how to audit who had access to administrative accounts, and how to ensure audits for record deletion. Others asked more pointed political questions about leadership and culture in the sheriff's office. The sheriff and the undersheriff were present in the chamber. Sheriff Hollister spoke briefly, reiterating his service to the county and denying the characterizations that the evidence suggested. Undersheriff Bridgewell declined to answer certain procedural questions on legal counsel's advice. The public side of the conversation was now a conversation about both what had been done and how the county would respond. When the council took its vote, the room felt measured and solemn rather than triumphant. The vote was 4-3 to suspend Sheriff Hollister with pay for the duration of an independent investigation and to initiate an external audit of the sheriff's office record-keeping practices. The vote threshold reflected the county's divided posture. A majority sought an investigative break, a minority cautioned about immediate punitive gestures before a full inquiry. The motion also called for a referral to external investigators to examine both the personnel conduct and the technical logs that Raymond and the ACLU had supplied. The council's motion would furthermore require that all administrative accounts be audited and that a temporary policy be created to prevent unilateral record redactions without multi-party review. The immediate consequences rippled outward. Within days, independent auditors were on site. The state attorney's office announced an inquiry into the alteration of records. Undersheriff Bridgewell was placed on administrative leave, and within a fortnight, his account was the subject of an inquiry that culminated in criminal charges related to unauthorized alteration of public records, charges the county attorney filed after consulting the ACLU's technical memo and the independent audit.
The specifics of the charges, carefully worded in legal filings, reference the alteration of arrest records and the misuse of administrative access in furtherance of that change. Bridgewell's attorneys would later contest the interpretation. Those proceedings moved into parallel court calendars. For the community, the indictment of an undersheriff was a kind of shorthand. The systems that allowed deletions now had an adult in the room responsible on paper. Hollister's fate tracked differently. He initially resisted calls for resignation, framing the controversy as a misunderstanding magnified by selective editing. But as audits progressed and the public's patience frayed, he faced a different reality. His own department's records no longer offered a tidy narrative he could claim. A pattern of arrests under his personal administration, the demographic mismatches, and the administrative reclassification of incidents all complicated his claim of routine enforcement. Under public pressure and amid the start of formal probes, he announced his resignation from the office. His resignation package, released in a council communication, also included a negotiated settlement on his retirement benefits that, while guaranteeing some pension protections, removed certain special allowances because of findings in the independent review. The county attorney's office later announced that additional administrative measures would be pursued concerning pension eligibility based on the independent review's findings. In short, the political and fiscal consequences were not musical, they were sober and bureaucratic. None of this happened as instantaneous retribution. The processes were messy and slow, filled with motions, legal filings, and hearings. But they were processes that moved in the same direction, a county acknowledging that private discretion over public records had consequences. For Pamela, the partial restoration of her public standing came not all at once but in increments. Her university rescinded the administrative leave a month later pending a fuller institutional review of how it handled the matter. Colleagues publicly endorsed her. Students rallied by writing op-eds and by circulating petitions calling for academic freedom. The university acknowledged that its initial decision had been cautious and then revised the terms of its investigation to include an examination of whether the leave was precipitous. The dean met Pamela in a small office and apologized for the way the decision had felt. It was not full restoration, but it was a sign that institutions could be responsive. Gloria Atkins was invited to join a community advisory panel that would help the county design reforms to sheriff's office procedures. She accepted. She said she wanted her participation to ensure that other mothers would not feel the same helplessness. She did not claim catharsis. She never claimed that a resignation or an audit would make Jerome whole.
Instead, she insisted that the county needed a different structure for how authority is displayed and documented. Raymond Oates faced less public approval than he had expected. Some characterized him as a whistleblower, others as an outsider who had messed with county data. In interviews, however, he described his motive simply. He could not watch a record be erased and not act. He cooperated with investigators and, in doing so, put professional costs on the line. He later said he felt relieved that the technical work he had done helped the truth emerge. The ACLU honored him in a small brief, recognizing the role of frontline technicians in preserving transparency. Diane Foster's career also shifted. Her confession and transfer of material damaged relationships with editors and some sources, but it also led to a moment of reckoning at her paper. Her editor announced a review of institutional relationships and promised greater transparency about the paper's sourcing. Diane's pieces following the hearing were reflective rather than combative. She wrote about the ethical slippage that can occur when reporters conflate access with fairness. She did not expect a medal. She wanted the record to be accurate. She had made a mistake, she said, and was owning it publicly. Pamela returned to the classroom in a semester that felt both ordinary and strange. Students greeted her with notes about the courage of preserving records and with questions about the next steps in policing reform. She taught a course that semester titled Policing and Public Records. She used the county materials, redacted where legally required, as a case study in how administrative practices shape the story that citizens receive. She also kept an office hour for community members who wanted to talk about their experiences. She did not seek a platform or celebrity. She sought to translate a painful personal episode into public teaching about accountability. The independent review that followed the council vote did not produce a tidy single verdict. Its findings were procedural and structural. Multiple instances where administrative discretion allowed records to be reclassified, patterns in arrest data that suggested disproportionate targeting in certain neighborhoods, gaps in oversight where a handful of administrators had broad, undocumented access to alter records. The review recommended a set of reforms: a multi-person authorization for record deletions, an automated retention protocol that archived raw booking footage for a specified time, external auditing of administrative accounts, and mandatory de-escalation training with oversight. The report also suggested the creation of a civilian oversight board with real subpoena power to ensure that future allegations could be tested without relying solely on internal actors.
In the weeks after the council vote, the sheriff's office instituted some immediate measures. Retention policies were clarified, access controls were tightened, and an external IT firm was hired to assess vulnerabilities.
The changes did not erase the memory of what had been done, but they created guardrails that had not existed before. The county also set aside funds for community-based restorative programming, meetings between officers and residents, mental health support, and funds for public record literacy workshops so residents could better understand how records and evidence are kept. Legal proceedings continued along multiple tracks. Bridgewell pleaded not guilty and contested the interpretation of his administrative actions. Hollister's resignation precluded certain personnel processes but did not resolve claims about the full spectrum of his actions in office. Civil claims from Pamela were filed and entered mediation. The legal calendar stretched. What mattered in the public sphere, however, was not the finality of courts, but the visible rework of institutional practice. Patterns are corrected by rules and people alike. Amid the bureaucratic churn, Pamela found pockets of gentle restoration. Students returned to class with a different kind of curiosity. A colleague invited her to co-author a paper examining retention policy across 5 counties. A small foundation offered a grant to study the human impacts of booking photo circulation. Dorothy, whose health stabilized with therapy and time, began to leave the house more often. They rebuilt some routines: a weekly walk, a neighbor's potluck, a careful conversation with a pastor. The things that had been scabbed raw began, slowly, to skin over. But the story did not end with a definitive exoneration or dramatic victory. There were no scenes of triumphant rejoicing, only a ledger of partial justice, a resignation, administrative reforms, and indictment of a high-ranking officer, policy changes, job losses, and the fragile restoration of a professor's public voice. Jerome's death remained a sad and complicated thread in the county's conscience. No single public action could fully repair that grief. Dorothy and Gloria and other family members continued to carry their losses and their anger. In public conversations afterwards, the sheriff's pause, those 15 seconds, was discussed less as a moment of personal weakness than as a window into how identity and power collide. In editorial pages and study halls, people debated the wider question Pamela had taught in class: what happens when the machinery of authority can edit memory? The answer, in many circles, became: insist that the machinery be transparent and that multiple, independent checkers exist to prevent unilateral erasure. In private, Pamela puzzled over the costs. She had lost a measure of professional stability and had paid the psychic price of seeing her mother harmed.
She had also accrued a set of new responsibilities: to testify, to advise reform efforts, and to watch closely as policies were implemented. She carried those responsibilities with gravity. She knew that the story would appear in articles and lectures for years, and that the thumbnail of a booking photo can follow a life. She also held a quieter conviction that evidence, once preserved and verified, is a civic asset. It is not merely material for a complaint. It is a way of telling the truth that institutions must honor. The county's reforms were not perfect. Some critics argued they were cosmetic. Others said that real change would require deeper cultural shifts, including sustained political attention and long-term oversight. Those critiques were valid. The changes made a dent, but not a cure. Institutions, like people, evolve imperfectly and slowly. Months after the hearing, Pamela and Dorothy sat on the front porch again. The maples had leafed out. Fireflies blinked. The house creaked in familiar ways. Pamela thumbed a copy of the Independent Review's executive summary and set it on the porch table. Dorothy reached for her hand. They spoke about small things: recipes, a neighbor's grandson, a church choir's upcoming concert. When the talk turned to the arrest, Dorothy said simply, "You stood up, honey." She did not mean heroics. She meant that Pamela had preserved what happened. She had demanded that the record be true. Pamela thought, as the porch light stained the yard amber, about identity. The sheriff had read a small card, and that card had given him pause. The county story had bent because a single object disclosed a known personhood: a scholar with standing, a neighbor with a name. Identity, in the end, is not only what a badge claims, but what a community recognizes. The card had not forced the sheriff's hand. It had revealed the power imbalance. What followed was the labor of accounting, bringing disparate files together, persuading an indifferent institution to listen, and cobbling a public record that could not be erased. There was no cinematic restoration. There was instead a sequence of practical outcomes that mattered in their ordinariness: audits instituted, policies changed, a resignation, charges filed, an undersheriff removed, an ACLU officially involved, and a community forced to reckon with disparity in enforcement.
For Pamela, the long work would continue: research, teaching, testimony, and the careful maintenance of records. For Dorothy, recovery was a new routine. For Gloria, grief was a calling to civic work. When asked, months later, what advice she would give to others who find themselves recorded in an ugly collision with authority, Pamela offered a sober, practical answer: preserve everything, make copies, involve independent verifiers, and resist the impulse to let professionals tidy a story without public oversight. Paper trails matter, she said. So do people who will hold the trails.
The final image was quiet. Pamela and Dorothy on the porch as the sun went down, the hush of neighborhood living around them, the hum of an unremarkable county evening. The business card that had been the story's hinge lived now in multiple places: a photocopy in Pamela's file, frames in council exhibits, and scanned versions in public archives. It remained a small rectangle, but it had done a disproportionate amount of work. It had made a man hesitate, brought a whistleblower forward, forced an ACLU audit, led to a council vote, and produced reforms. It had also, inevitably, cost lives and health, and left behind a complicated ledger of injuries and corrections. If this reporting moved you, consider sharing the story with someone who cares about civic accountability. If you want to take action beyond sharing, look to reputable civil rights organizations working on record transparency and police oversight in your area. Supporting them helps make sure information stays available and institutions are held to account. The work is practical, often slow, and rarely complete, but evidence, once preserved and verified, gives communities a way to insist that their stories not be erased.